Once upon a time, there was a very wealthy man who had a rather unique idea for finding a wife. He decided to disguise himself as a beggar and go to a beauty pageant at a large television studio in Rio de Janeiro. In front of the studio, a line of very beautiful women began to form. They were all wearing makeup and dressed in flashy, eye-catching clothes. Passers-by grew curious and wondered why so many women were waiting in front of that gate. Those who stopped to watch saw the women entering the studio, all walking in high heels, exuding charm. These 27 women were competing in a beauty pageant, with each one representing a different state of Brazil. In addition to their beauty, they had to showcase some cultural knowledge about their region. But what no one knew was that, besides competing for the pageant crown, they were also unknowingly taking part in an additional secret competition. Daniel, the youngest son of the television network's owner, was eager to get married but had no patience for meeting new people. Used to always getting what he wanted, Daniel decided he would marry one of the pageant contestants, with the event being broadcast on his father's channel. However, Daniel didn't just want to marry a beautiful woman. He wanted someone who wasn't interested in his money. In short, he wanted a wife who would love him for who he was, not for what he had. Daniel knew that if the contestants discovered who his father was, they might try to marry him solely for the money. At 35 years old, he longed for true love, but never felt like anyone genuinely cared for him. His father's wealth had always been an obstacle. While Daniel planned his disguise, Beatriz, the assistant to the producer organizing the beauty pageant, was busy managing the 27 contestants. Beatriz was 30 years old and didn't care much about her appearance. Her hair was always messy, she rarely wore makeup, and her clothes were often wrinkled or worn out. For her, it was both funny and somewhat ironic to be working at a beauty pageant, given how unpolished she was. Beatriz's job was to guide the contestants and provide them with the schedule for the recordings. The big night of the pageant was just 2 days away, and until then, all the contestants needed to film some special scenes for the show. These recordings included outdoor shots, with the next one scheduled to take place at a park near the network. The idea was for the women, wearing sashes with the names of their states, to introduce themselves to the cameras and talk about their dreams and plans. It was shaping up to be a long morning for Beatriz. From early on, the atmosphere backstage was tense, and she knew it would be difficult to keep calm among the 27 beauty pageant contestants. Each of them carried their own dreams and anxieties, but instead of coming together for a common goal, the scene was filled with fierce competition and small rivalries, making Beatriz's job even harder. As the contestants prepared, Beatriz tried in vain to give some important instructions. Ladies, remember to be friendly with everyone you meet at the park. We never know when the cameras might be rolling, and any mistake could be fatal, she repeated, gesturing to get their attention. But much to her frustration, few seemed to be listening. Instead, they were more concerned with looking at themselves in the mirror, adjusting their hair, or checking their makeup. Some of the more competitive ones were even busy watching for weaknesses in the others, fueling the rivalry even more. Beatriz sighed, feeling exhausted. Deep down, she knew that this attitude could cost the contestants dearly. After all, charm was a crucial criterion for the jury, and a slip-up could ruin everything. She glanced at Gabriella and Lai, two of the few who seemed to be paying attention. The two young women were different from the others. Gabriella had an easy smile and a helpful disposition that set her apart. Lai, on the other hand, was more reserved but always asked relevant questions, wanting to understand every detail to avoid problems. These two have a good chance, Beatriz thought, feeling a glimmer of hope that at least one of them would take the crown home. After much insistence, Beatriz finally managed to gather all the contestants and guide them to the vans that would take them to the park. Despite the location being close to the studio, she knew it was essential for them to arrive in perfect condition, without sweating or appearing tired. The cameras captured everything, and in that competitive environment, any detail could make a difference. As the vans headed to the park, Daniel, the youngest son of one of the TV magnates, prepared to put his bold plan into action. He had decided to disguise himself as a beggar to observe the contestants up close without being recognized. Daniel had always been curious about how people really are when they are not in the spotlight. With the help of the station's makeup artists and costume designers, he underwent a transformation that made him unrecognizable. Fake dirt was applied to his face and hands. His clothes were tattered and stained, and even his normally well-groomed hair was disheveled. Despite all the makeup, his handsome face could still be discerned by someone who looked closely, but the beggar appearance was convincing enough to fool most people. When the filming started in the park, the usual chaos ensued. Some contestants, instead of focusing on the instructions, found any excuse to pick on each other. The latest fight involved Fernanda and Julia. Somehow, Fernanda managed to break the zipper on Julia's dress with a handbag, leaving the other contestant desperate and on the verge of tears. Beatriz, seeing the situation, tried to intervene, but felt that her task of maintaining peace was becoming increasingly impossible. As she tried to comfort Julia and call a seamstress to save the dress, Beatriz didn't notice that a beggar was approaching the filming area. The beggar, of course, was Daniel, who watched everything attentively. He noticed every detail: the childish fights, Gabriella and Laya's small acts of kindness, and Beatriz's efforts to keep everything under control. At that moment, he understood that the camera's glare often hides people's true essence. It was a hectic day at the park, with many curious onlookers watching the filming of a TV show. The producers didn't anticipate that a homeless man would come near the contestants. Fernanda, who disliked anything out of place, was the first to notice the man in ragged clothes wandering around. Although she thought he had a certain charm, she quickly dismissed him as a nobody. With disdain, she pointed at the man and said to Beatriz, "Look, there's a beggar hanging around the filming. Get him out of here immediately." Beatriz, already tired of Fernanda's complaints and those of the other contestants, calmly looked at the man. Taking a deep breath, she replied, "He's not harming anyone, Fernanda. This park is public. He has as much right to be here as we do." Fernanda, unhappy, muttered that she would speak to the show's director. Beatriz, in turn, began to question her own career. She knew she would have to listen to yet another long speech from Carlos, the show's director. Carlos was a middle-aged man obsessed with his appearance. He had undergone almost every cosmetic procedure possible to maintain a youthful look, but the result was a face so stretched that he could barely move it. As soon as Fernanda mentioned Carlos's name, he appeared to check on how the recordings were going. The homeless man was still around, but the other candidates either ignored him or treated him poorly. When Carlos arrived, he didn't even notice the man who stood out so much from the rest of the people. Fernanda rushed to complain about the presence of the homeless man and also criticized Beatriz for not wanting to kick him out. With a serious look, Carlos asked Beatriz why she was being so soft. Maybe she didn't know, but there were many people wanting her spot. Trying to fix Julia's dress zipper, Beatriz, timidly, replied that she valued the opportunity she had a lot and that she hadn't done anything because the park was a public space. Moreover, Beatriz pointed out that there were different media outlets covering the recording. If they kicked out the homeless man, it would be recorded and would be on social media within seconds. Carlos, knowing Beatriz was right, told Fernanda that it was best to ignore the man. Meanwhile, the homeless man, who was actually Daniel was in disguise, walking around the recording area. The candidates barely noticed him, so he took advantage of the situation to listen to their conversations. Most of them talked about light topics or criticized other competitors. Nothing seemed interesting until he heard something different. An assistant, who looked quite tired and a bit disheveled, finally found a moment and called someone, probably from her family. She vented, saying she was very stressed because some of the candidates were quite difficult to deal with. Additionally, she wanted more time to work on a documentary project about the lives of animals in big cities. From what Daniel understood, the assistant's name was Beatriz, and she was a journalist but had never managed to get a chance in her field due to her appearance. At that moment, Daniel realized how unfair the world could be to those who didn't fit beauty standards. Beatriz's observations about the situation were so insightful that, for a moment, Daniel almost found her attractive. However, he soon remembered why he was there in disguise as a beggar. He wanted to find his future wife, someone he would marry and have children with. Being young, handsome, and very rich, he was looking for a beautiful woman. Although he recognized the injustices of the world, he was not willing to change his standards. To test the candidates' reactions, he needed them to interact with him. So, he approached Vanessa and Gabriella, asking if either of them could help him with some change to buy a bread. Vanessa looked him up and down and, with disdain, said he should get a job if he wanted to eat, implying that he shouldn't even speak to women as beautiful as them. Gabriella, on the other hand, was more kind. She took a 5 Brazilian reals bill from her purse and handed it to him, playfully asking if he would use the money to eat or drink. Daniel, who was assessing each candidate, began to think that Gabriella might be the ideal wife. Grateful, he said he would use the money to eat, as he lived on the streets and depended on people's kindness. But Gabriella, still suspicious, replied that her boyfriend always said it was important to help, even if he didn't know if the money would be used for food or drink. Hearing that Gabriella had a boyfriend, Daniel's smile disappeared. He turned away discouraged. How could someone so beautiful and kind not be single? He continued asking for coins from other candidates, but only 2 more gave him something. Many ignored him or were rude. Almost at the end of the recording, Daniel saw Beatrice sitting in the shade of a tree with a sad expression. Daniel, with keen and curious eyes, couldn't stop thinking about the girl he had seen from afar. Dressed as a beggar, in tattered clothes and with an unshaved beard, he knew he wasn't his best self. Still, something about Beatrice intrigued him, and he couldn't resist the urge to approach her. He had been ignored and mistreated by so many other people that day, but something told him this woman might be different. With cautious steps, Daniel approached Beatrice, who was distracted, likely lost in her own thoughts. When his shadow fell over her, the young woman startled. She quickly looked up, and her eyes met Daniel's. At that moment, he braced himself for the usual reaction, a look of disdain or, worse, fear. But to his surprise, Beatrice didn't push him away. Instead, she laughed in a spontaneous and slightly embarrassed way. "Sorry for scaring you," she said, trying to justify her fright. "I thought you were one of the contestants asking for something impossible. I'm so tired." There was something in her tone, a mix of exhaustion and venting, that made Daniel realize she was different from the others he had encountered that day. Daniel smiled, a genuine smile he hadn't worn in a long time. "I'm the one who should apologize for startling you by arriving so quietly," he replied, trying to ease her discomfort. Beatrice seemed to study him for a moment, as if trying to understand who this man before her was. "I saw you were asking for money for the girls in the contest to eat," she commented, with a hint of compassion in her voice. "I imagine they probably didn't contribute much. I don't have any money, but I brought these sandwiches for a snack. If you want, I can give you one." Her generosity took Daniel by surprise. He, who had spent the day being ignored, was now being treated with kindness by a complete stranger. And, what was even more curious, he knew she had faced trouble because of him. The contestants, nervous about his presence, had complained to Beatrice, and she, despite being tired, still reached out to help him. For a brief moment, Daniel considered revealing the truth to Beatrice, telling her who he really was, why he was there, the plan he was executing to find a wife. But he knew that doing so might jeopardize everything. Still, shame began to grow in his chest. Determined not to succumb to guilt, he sat down next to Beatrice under a tree that offered a comforting shade. The afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, creating patterns of light and shadow on the ground. Daniel accepted the sandwich Beatrice offered him, and, while eating, observed the young woman's delicate features. She looked exhausted, yet still had a glimmer of kindness in her eyes that he couldn't ignore. "If you want, you can come to my house to take a shower," Beatrice said, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "I live with my older brother, and he can lend you a clean outfit." Daniel hesitated, wondering what it would be like to enter a stranger's home. "Won't your brother be upset about this?" he asked, genuinely curious. Beatrice shook her head with a reassuring smile. "No, he's generous. Besides, he set aside some clothes for donation a while ago. I'm sure he won't mind." Accepting Beatrice's invitation was something Daniel did almost without thinking. As they walked together to the bus stop, he found himself questioning his decision. Of all the women he had observed during the recordings, Beatrice was the last one he would have imagined sparking his interest. Yet, here he was accompanying her to her home, On the bus, Daniel felt the suspicious glances of the other passengers. He was used to being judged by his appearance, but this time, he didn't mind. The conversation with Beatriz was engaging, and he lost himself in her words, forgetting about the people around him. When they arrived at Beatriz's house, Daniel was surprised by its simplicity. The house wasn't large or luxurious, but there was something cozy about it. The furniture was simple but well cared for, and there were plants everywhere, adding a touch of life and color to the environment. It was clear that Beatriz and her brother didn't have much money, but what they lacked in luxury, they made up for with warmth and kindness. While Beatriz was showing the house, Daniel couldn't help but feel a growing admiration for her. It wasn't just for the generosity she had shown, but for the way she turned the simple into something special. Beatriz and her brother Cesar had a very special relationship. One day, she came home with a young man who lived on the street, and Cesar found this quite strange. But Beatriz explained that she had met him during the filming of the TV show she worked on and that he needed help. Cesar, always as generous as his sister, decided to help and offered the young man, named Daniel, a bath and clean clothes that he was going to donate. During dinner, Cesar had a feeling that he had seen Daniel somewhere before, but couldn't remember where. This feeling grew stronger after the young man had bathed and dressed. Unable to come to any conclusion, Cesar decided to go to bed since he had to wake up early the next day. Before going to bed, he asked Beatriz to set up Daniel in the living room and lock the bedroom door, just as a precaution. If anything went wrong, she was to shout. Beatriz, even knowing it wasn't safe to bring strangers home, wasn't afraid. However, something seemed out of the ordinary. As she tried to sleep, Beatriz started thinking. Despite dressing like a beggar, Daniel didn't act or speak like one. Maybe he hadn't always lived on the streets. What she could never imagine was that the young man who seemed so poor was actually the son of the owner of the TV station where she worked. The next day, after breakfast, Daniel asked if he could go with Beatriz to the TV station area. She, worried that he might cause trouble with the contest candidates, asked why he wanted to go. Daniel said he just wanted to return to the place where he used to ask for help. Cesar, noticing that Daniel was interested in finding a job, offered him an interview at the factory where he worked for a position on the assembly line. Daniel thanked him for the opportunity, but explained that on that specific day, he needed to return to the place where Beatriz had found him. Beatriz, sensing Daniel's urgency, agreed to take him, as long as he promised not to ask the contest candidates for money. Daniel thought he wouldn't ask for money, but perhaps he would ask for one of their hands in marriage. It was a shame that Gabriella, whom he thought was very generous and beautiful, already had a boyfriend. Even so, he still hoped to find another candidate with all the qualities he was looking for. Daniel realized that if he could combine the appearance of any of the candidates with Beatriz's personality, he would have the perfect woman. Unfortunately, Beatriz wasn't as pretty, but as he looked at her, Daniel found himself thinking differently. He quickly shook his head to clear these thoughts. When Beatriz saw the gesture, she laughed and asked what was on his mind. Embarrassed, Daniel replied that he was just lost in his own dreams. The two took the bus to the TV station. During the long trip, no one looked at Daniel with disdain, as he was now clean and well-groomed, thanks to Beatriz's and her brother's generosity. When they got off at the stop near the station, Beatriz said goodbye to Daniel and wished him good luck. She reminded him that her brother had offered him a job opportunity at the factory, and Daniel promised he would come back to talk to her. As soon as Beatriz entered the studio, she felt her peace disappear. The documentary project about the city's animals seemed farther away than ever. She needed to take the contestants to the park near the station to redo some footage that hadn't turned out well, mainly because the contestants hadn't paid attention to the instructions during the first shoot. While they were filming again, Beatriz noticed Daniel approaching. She couldn't believe that, after everything she had done for him, Daniel was there, apparently to disrupt the filming once again. Even more dressed up than before, his presence annoyed several contestants. Laura, one of the most beautiful, didn't hesitate to complain, saying she was being harassed by a beggar. Daniel, keeping his composure, replied that he wasn't doing anything wrong. After all, the park was public, and he had every right to watch the filming. Carlos, who had been irritable since the day before, approached ready to shout, but upon recognizing Daniel, he momentarily lost his voice. Realizing the danger of being discovered, Daniel stepped forward and said to Carlos, "I'm a beggar, but I have the right to watch the filming in a public place. Just because I'm a beggar doesn't mean I don't have my rights." He emphasized the word beggar so that Carlos would understand not to reveal his disguise. Cleverly, Carlos soon sensed that there was more to those words. Nonetheless, he remained firm and said in a rude tone, "It's true, beggar. I can't throw you out of a public place, but I expect you to behave and not cause any trouble." Carlos tried to impress the girls, but he ended up looking quite fake. At the end of the scene, he even gave an exaggerated wink. Daniel, who was watching everything, was irritated, thinking how a director could act so poorly. Despite this, he believed his disguise was secure. Beatrice, who saw everything from a distance, found it strange that Carlos had given up so easily. Normally, that annoying man would continue shouting until the security guards removed the beggar. But at least he accepted that the homeless person would remain nearby, which made Beatrice a bit more at ease. The afternoon of filming passed without many issues. Daniel tried to talk to the participants, but managed little more than eating another sandwich in the shade of a tree with Beatrice. The young woman asked if Daniel would like to stay at her house again, but this time he declined. Without much explanation, he turned his back and left. Beatrice was upset and frustrated by Daniel's indifferent behavior. The next day, Beatrice was extremely busy. The contest would be broadcast live that night. In the morning, she had a quick coffee with Cesar and recounted everything that had happened the day before. Her brother was also displeased to learn that Daniel, their guest of honor, had treated his sister with disdain. When Beatrice mentioned that, despite Daniel being homeless, he didn't seem like someone in trouble, Cesar agreed. It was strange how Daniel spoke so well and was so polite at the table. Cesar had a feeling he knew Daniel from somewhere. Beatrice left the house in a rush, barely finishing her meal. Later, Cesar, who was off duty, took the opportunity to meet his girlfriend, Nadia. She loved hearing the stories from Beatrice's work that he shared. This was the closest contact Nadia had with television, and she found it exciting. To explain more about the contest his sister was involved in, Cesar checked the TV station's social media. As he scrolled through the photos, he saw an image of the station owner's heirs. At first, he thought he was mistaken, but then he realized he recognized Daniel. His face was familiar because Cesar often checked the station's social media profiles to tell Nadia about the day-to-day of television. Now, he needed to understand why that young man, the owner's son, was pretending to be a beggar. Daniel had a rather crazy plan. He decided to disguise himself as a beggar and hide at the house of an assistant who didn't know he was the heir to the major TV network. Daniel's sister, Nadia, was unaware of this. Daniel thought it was time to tell his sister the truth. So he took a picture of himself dressed as a beggar and sent it to Beatrice. Beatrice was busy trying to break up a fight between two candidates who were much bigger than she was and couldn't see her brother's message. The confusion increased as the competition approached. Beatrice was worried and thought that if she hadn't gone crazy by then, she wouldn't go crazy anymore. At 10 p.m., the contest began and the elimination rounds took place. With each elimination, Beatrice had to break up fights between the eliminated candidates and those still in the competition. Some of those who left wanted to ruin the clothes and hairstyles of those who remained. Gabriella and Lai, who were friends of Beatrice, continued in the competition. Beatrice was rooting for them, but Fernando was also in the running and was a very strong contender. When only 3 candidates remained, it was announced that one of the heirs of the network would come on stage to reveal the grand prizes of the competition. When Daniel appeared on stage, dressed in an elegant suit, he surprised everyone. Fernanda did not recognize Daniel as the beggar she had mistreated. But seeing the surprise on Gabriella's and Laia's faces, Fernanda realized what was happening. Daniel smiled and introduced himself. "I'm Daniel, and for the past 2 days, I've been mingling with the contestants without revealing my identity." Beatrice, who was watching the show from backstage, couldn't believe it. The simple and poorly dressed young man who had stayed at her house was actually the network heir. She thought it was a part of the competition's challenge, and despite Daniel's deception, she wasn't angry. Daniel explained that he had disguised himself as a beggar to get to know the contestants better and was impressed by the generosity of some of them. But he also pointed out that the world is still very focused on appearances and that not everyone values people for who they truly are. Daniel announced that the winner would receive a cash prize, a brand new car, and a scholarship for a university course of their choice. The presenters then revealed that Lai had come in third place. So, only Fernanda and Gabriella remained. Beatrice found it odd that Fernanda had made it to the final, considering she had treated Daniel very poorly when she thought he was a beggar. Beatrice began to suspect that maybe Daniel's speech wasn't entirely true, even though he had said that people are sometimes judged not for who they really are. After a long commercial break, the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived, announcing the grand champion of the beauty contest. Everyone was on the edge of their seats, eager to find out which of the two girls would take home the crown and all those prizes. Beatrice smiled when she heard the presenters call Gabriella's name as the winner. Gabriella, always so kind to everyone on the show, was crowned the most beautiful of the contest. Fernanda, who came in second, tried to hide her sadness and anger. Then, Beatrice saw Daniel approaching Fernanda and saying something to her. Fernanda smiled and nodded. It didn't take long for Beatrice to find out that Daniel had invited Fernanda to talk backstage. Rumors spread that he was looking for a beautiful wife, and since Gabriella was already committed, he decided to try something with the second-place contestant. Beatrice was very disappointed. She thought about how Daniel was empty and deceitful. If he had disguised himself as a beggar to find out how the contestants really were, why was he now interested in the second-place finisher? At least the contest was over, and she could be transferred to another project at the network. Losing that job wasn't an option for her. As Beatrice was leaving the network to catch her bus, she saw Daniel talking intimately with Fernanda. Daniel saw her and decided to run after her to say goodbye. Beatrice, who didn't want to talk, quickened her pace. Daniel started shouting for her to wait. She then turned around and asked what he wanted. Seeing that Beatrice was upset, Daniel apologized for pretending to be a beggar. Beatrice looked him straight in the eyes and said, "I don't care about your lousy beggar act. What I can't understand is how you have such an unrealistic speech." Daniel looked at her, confused about why she was being so harsh. The assistant then nodded toward Fernanda, and Daniel began to try to justify the unjustifiable. He said, "I realized that unfortunately, I'm not going to find everything I'm looking for in a woman, so I decided to go with beauty. Maybe it's a mistake to date Fernanda, but she is really very beautiful." Beatrice responded, "Then you haven't learned anything from your experience as a beggar." And she walked away. In the following weeks, Daniel started dating Fernanda, but even her beauty didn't seem to make him happy. Once upon a time, there was a young woman who spent all her time bad-mouthing Gabriella and complaining about coming in second place. Whenever the topic came up, Daniel thought about the conversations he had with Beatrice while they ate sandwiches under a tree or at the assistant's house. Daniel did everything he could to bring Beatrice onto the journalism team, even though she judged him for his choices. He really wanted her to have good opportunities, and from the news he received, he knew Beatrice was doing very well. After several attempts to muster the courage, Daniel finally went to where Beatrice was working. Observing her from a distance, he realized that, although Beatrice wasn't the most beautiful of the beauty contest participants, she was indeed very charming. That's when he understood that he had always wanted the assistant who seemed a bit disheveled. That day, Daniel didn't speak with Beatrice. He ran off and called Fernanda for a conversation. Fernanda was excited, thinking he was going to propose. But to her surprise, Daniel ended the relationship, saying they were too different. Fernanda was left confused. Then, Daniel had a change of heart and went to find Beatrice with 2 sandwiches in a bag. He asked if she would like to eat with him under the tree. Beatrice, confused but curious, agreed. During their conversation, Daniel asked if they could go out to get to know each other better. After a long pause, Beatrice said yes, but he would still need to win Cesar's forgiveness, her brother. Concerned, Daniel asked if Cesar was angry, and Beatrice, laughing, explained it was just a joke. She told him Cesar found it amusing to see a rich guy trying to act poor. Daniel learned that he shouldn't judge people just by their appearance, and that, In the end, he had been acting like those who belittled him. I hope you enjoyed this story full of twists and emotions. If you liked it and want more exciting stories like this, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Here, every story is a new adventure, and we're always ready to surprise you. Also, leave your comments on what you thought and suggestions for future narratives. See you next time.